In the damp, golden light of early September 1944, the supreme commanders of the Western Allied armies believed they were watching the final, agonizing collapse of Nazi Germany. D-Day was 3 months behind them. The Wehrmacht had been utterly shattered in the Normandy pocket, leaving behind tens of thousands of destroyed vehicles, dead soldiers, and burning wreckage across the French countryside. The Allied armies had surged across the Seine, liberated Paris, swept through Belgium, and pushed right up to the borders of the German Reich. The enemy seemed broken, fleeing on bicycles, stolen horse carts and foot, stripped of their heavy armor and drained of their fighting spirit. Among the Allied high command, a euphoric optimism took hold. Victory felt not just inevitable, but imminent. The war, many openly predicted, would be over by Christmas. Yet in London, and at frontline headquarters in Western Europe, a fierce and acrimonious debate was raging over how to land the final blow. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, favored a cautious, broad front strategy. He wanted to advance all along the Western Front, pressing the Germans everywhere simultaneously, securing supply lines and methodical progress. But his most famous, controversial British subordinate, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, vehemently disagreed. Montgomery argued that the broad front approach was wasteful, sluggish, and allowed the retreating enemy time to recover. What was needed, Montgomery insisted, was a single, bold, devastating thrust. A narrow spearhead driven straight through the Netherlands, across the lower reaches of the Rhine River, and directly into the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley. Stripped of its factories, coal and steel, the Nazi war machine would instantly suffocate, bringing the Third Reich to its knees. Eisenhower was hesitant, but Montgomery was relentless. Moreover, Allied logistics were at a breaking point. Gasoline, ammunition, and rations were running dangerously low as supply trucks struggled to carry goods hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches to the front line. Eisenhower eventually conceded to Montgomery's ambitious proposal. He granted priority of precious fuel and supplies to an operation so daring, so massive, and so complex that it seemed to belong to the realm of fiction rather than military reality. The operation was codenamed Market Garden. It would become the largest airborne assault in human history, dropping over 35,000 airborne troops deep behind enemy lines to seize a narrow corridor of roads and bridges across the rivers and canals of the occupied Netherlands. At the center of this audacious plan stood a man whose name would forever be tied to its triumphant vision and its tragic collapse. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning. Known universally to his peers and subordinates as Boy Browning, he was the deputy commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army and the senior commander of the British Airborne Corps. Browning was the epitome of the aristocratic British military officer. Impeccably groomed, fiercely protective of his reputation, married to the celebrated novelist Daphne du Maurier, and decorated for bravery in the First World War, Browning was a passionate advocate for airborne warfare. He possessed an unwavering belief in the elite status and elite capabilities of his paratroopers. To Browning, Market Garden was not merely a military operation. It was the ultimate proof that airborne forces could alter the course of modern history. The operational plan was divided into 2 distinct parts: Operation Market, the airborne assault, and Operation Garden, the ground offensive. Operation Market required 3 full airborne divisions: the American 101st Airborne, the American 82nd Airborne, and the British 1st Airborne Division, joined by the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade, to drop into Holland simultaneously. They were tasked with seizing 64 miles of highway and key bridges spanning a dozen water obstacles, including major rivers like the Maas, the Waal, and the Lower Rhine. While the paratroopers held these vital crossings, Operation Garden would launch. The British Third Corps, a formidable armoured column commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Urquhart, would charge down the narrow highway, racing across each secured bridge one after another, until they reached the final, most crucial bridge of all, the massive steel road bridge across the Rhine at the Dutch town of Arnhem. Once Disick's corps crossed the Rhine at Arnhem, the Allied armies would bypass the formidable defences of the German Siegfried Line altogether, opening the gateway straight into Berlin. On paper, the plan possessed a breathtaking mathematical simplicity. But behind the maps, the coloured arrows and the confident briefings, a dark shadow was beginning to gather over the planning rooms of the Allied High Command. To succeed, Market Garden relied on a series of assumptions that were dangerously optimistic. It assumed that the ground column of XXX Corps could advance down a single elevated two-lane highway, a narrow strip of tarmac surrounded by soft, marshy polder land, at a blistering pace without being halted by enemy anti-tank teams. It assumed that the Dutch bridges could be captured intact before the Germans had time to blow them up. Most dangerously of all, it assumed that the German forces defending Holland were nothing more than a disorganized rabble of old men, Hitler Youth, and demoralized garrison troops, incapable of offering organized resistance. As the launch date of September 17th approached, unsettling hints began to emerge that contradicted this comfortable narrative. Deep within the intelligence apparatus of the Allied military, whispers of a far more dangerous reality began to surface. Dutch resistance fighters, operating at immense personal peril, smuggled urgent coded messages through secret radio links to British intelligence. Their reports were specific and chilling. Heavily armoured German units were moving into the dense, forested areas surrounding Arnhem. Tanks, assault guns, and elite SS troops were taking up positions just miles from the designated drop zones of the British 1st Airborne Division. These reports caught the attention of a brilliant 25-year-old British intelligence officer attached to the Airborne Corps headquarters, Major Brian Urquhart. Disturbed by the underground reports, Urquhart requested urgent aerial reconnaissance over flights of the Arnhem region. A high-altitude Spitfire equipped with specialized cameras swept low over the Dutch countryside, capturing detailed aerial photographs of the pine woods near Arnhem. When the film was developed and brought to Major Urquhart's desk, what he saw made his blood run cold. Concealed beneath the heavy canopy of the trees were unmistakable silhouettes of heavy armor: Panther tanks, Panzer IVs, and armored half-tracks. Further intelligence, cross-referenced with top-secret ultra-radio intercepts decrypted at Bletchley Park, confirmed the nightmare scenario. The forces gathering around Arnhem were not demoralized garrison troops. They were the veteran soldiers of the 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, and the 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg, collectively known as the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of the formidable General Wilhelm Bittrich. These elite armoured divisions had been pulled back from the Normandy front to the quiet sanctuary of Arnhem to refit, rest, and rebuild. Major Urquhart knew instantly what this meant. If the lightly armed British paratroopers, equipped only with rifles, light machine guns, and small anti-tank weapons, jumped directly onto two fully equipped SS Panzer divisions, it would not be a victory. It would be a slaughter. Armed with the photographic evidence, Urquhart rushed to present his findings directly to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning. He placed the crisp, zoomed-in photographs on the table, pointing out the tank treads, the armoured hulls, and the artillery emplacements hidden in the foliage. He pleaded with his commander to take the threat seriously, arguing that the operation must be modified or delayed until the threat of heavy armour could be properly addressed. Browning listened to the young officer, but his reaction was not one of gratitude or concern. Instead, Browning displayed a cool, dismissive detachment. High-level Allied leadership from Montgomery down had already committed emotionally and strategically to Market Garden. The momentum of the plan was immense, and no anyone was eager to hear evidence that might derail the war's grand finale. Browning dismissed the intelligence as overblown and alarmist. He suggested that the tanks visible in the photographs were likely unserviceable, undergoing repairs or lacking fuel and ammunition. He argued that the German units were severely depleted, broken in spirit, and incapable of mounting a coordinated counterattack against elite Allied paratroopers.
When Major Urquhart refused to back down, insisting that the danger was mortal and indisputable, Browning chose to silence the messenger rather than confront the message. He treated the young major's intense urgency not as professional competence, but as a sign of psychological instability. Browning ordered the division's medical officer to examine Urquhart, claiming that the young intelligence officer was suffering from extreme stress and nervous exhaustion. Major Urquhart was promptly placed on compulsory medical leave and removed from headquarters, his warnings buried under a tide of institutional complacency. Major Urquhart was not the only voice raising alarms. The commander of the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade, Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, was equally horrified by the plan. Sosabowski was a tough, experienced Polish officer who held deep suspicions about British planning methods. When shown the operational details of Market Garden, Sosabowski was astonished by its flaws. The British plan required his Polish paratroopers to drop south of the lower Rhine days after the initial assault, without guaranteed artillery or air support, while the British 1st Airborne Division landed miles away from the main Arnhem Bridge due to soft ground and anti-aircraft threats near the river. Sosabowski loudly challenged Browning and the British staff during operational briefings, warning that the Germans were far stronger than admitted, and that landing troops 8 miles from their primary target violated every basic principle of airborne tactics. His sharp warnings were treated by Browning and the British establishment not as tactical wisdom, but as arrogance, uncooperativeness, and defeatism. The warnings were ignored. The wheels of the great war machine continued to turn. On the morning of Sunday, September 17, 1944, the autumn air over southern England thundered with the roar of thousands of aircraft engines. More than 2,000 transport planes and gliders lifted off from airfields across Britain, filling the skies with an airborne armada that stretched as far as the eye could see. Inside the cramped, vibrating fuselages, thousands of young American, British, and Polish soldiers checked their parachutes, adjusted their heavy equipment packs, and waited in tense silence. They were flying into history, confident that they were launching the final blow that would bring the horrific war in Europe to an end. As the aircraft crossed the English Channel and made their way over the flooded fields and canal networks of occupied Holland, the weather was clear and brilliant. The initial drop was a magnificent display of military precision. Thousands of white, green, and camouflage parachutes blossomed in the sky, drifting down onto the designated drop zones near Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. To the troopers floating downward, the countryside seemed deceptively peaceful, dotted with red-roofed farmhouses, windmill towers, and cheering Dutch civilians who rushed out of their homes in joy, waving orange flags to welcome their liberators. For the American 101st Airborne Division, landing in the south near Eindhoven, the early hours brought swift success. They secured key bridges across the Wilhelmina and Willems canals, though German engineers managed to blow up the bridge at Sonn just moments before the paratroopers could reach it. This single explosion forced British engineers to work frantically under fire to construct a temporary Bailey Bridge, delaying the advance of the ground armoured column of 30 Corps by vital hours. Further north, the American 82nd Airborne Division under Brigadier General James Gavin dropped near Nijmegen, seizing the high ground of the Oosterbeek Heights and moving to secure the vital bridges over the Maas River at Grave and the Maas-Waals Canal. But the massive 800-foot steel road bridge at Nijmegen remained firmly in German hands, heavily defended by dug-in enemy forces. It was at the northernmost point of the corridor, the furthest tip of the spear at Arnhem, that the tragic flaws of the operation immediately began to unravel. The British 1st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart, no relation to Major Brian Urquhart, made a successful drop onto landing zones north of the lower Rhine. But as planned, these drop zones were situated 8 long miles west of the Arnhem Road Bridge. Tactical air commanders had refused to land gliders and paratroopers closer to the bridge, fearing that the marshy polderland along the riverbank would trap gliders,
and that heavy German anti-aircraft batteries around the nearby Dielan airfield would destroy the transport planes.
This decision meant that the British paratroopers lost the supreme advantage of airborne operations, the element of surprise. Instead of dropping directly onto their objective, they were forced to march 8 miles through wooded suburbs and narrow streets to reach the bridge. To make matters worse, the division possessed only a small number of lightweight vehicles, many of which were destroyed or lost when their heavy gliders crashed. As the British paratroopers began their march toward Arnhem on foot, the radio communications network broke down almost completely. The division had been issued Type 68 radio sets, which lacked the necessary power and were fitted with incorrect crystals. Signals were blocked by the dense pine forests and built-up urban areas. Major General Urquhart found himself unable to communicate with his brigade commanders, his artillery, or Browning's Corps headquarters in Nijmegen. He was commanding a division in the dark. While the British marched through the quiet woods toward Arnhem, an astonishing coincidence occurred that changed the trajectory of the battle. At a quiet luxury hotel in the suburban village of Oosterbeek, just west of Arnhem, Field Marshal Walter Model, the brilliant, ruthless commander of German Army Group B, was sitting down to lunch. When British gliders and parachutes began falling from the sky just miles from his headquarters, Model was stunned. Assuming that the British paratroopers had been dropped specifically to capture him, the German Field Marshal hastily packed his papers, jumped into his staff car, and sped away to the headquarters of General Wilhelm Bittrich's 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Model's unexpected presence near the drop zone transformed the German reaction. Rather than falling into chaos, the German response was instantaneous, lethal, and brilliantly organized. General Bittrich, realizing that the Allied drop was a major attempt to seize the Rhine bridges, ordered his 2 SS Panzer divisions into action without a moment's delay. The 9th SS Panzer Division, Hohenstaufen, was ordered to secure Arnhem and the river crossings, while the 10th SS Panzer Division, Frundsberg, was dispatched south toward Nijmegen to block the advancing Allied armor. Within hours of the Allied drop, the very armored units whose existence British High Command had denied were rolling out of the woods, their heavy tracks clattering against the cobblestone roads of Arnhem. As 3 British battalions advanced along separate routes toward Arnhem, they ran headlong into a wall of German steel. Kampfgruppe Kraft, an armored SS training unit, had established a defensive line across the main roads, supported by armored cars, mortars, and infantry. 2 of the British columns were quickly pinned down, engaged in brutal close-quarters firefights among suburban villas and brick houses, unable to break through to the river. Only 1 column managed to bypass the German blockades. Led by the charismatic Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, the 2nd Battalion of the British 1st Airborne Division pushed along a southern road close to the riverbank, using the terrain for cover. By nightfall on September 17th, Frost and approximately 500 men reached the northern end of the magnificent Arnhem Road Bridge. They immediately occupied the brick houses, office buildings, and pillboxes overlooking the northern ramp, establishing defensive firing positions in windows, attics, and cellars. Frost's men tried to seize the southern end of the bridge as well, sending a small force across under cover of darkness. But as they neared the southern ramp, they were met by a devastating hail of fire from German armored vehicles and flamethrowers. An attempt to clear the bridge using an armored flamethrower vehicle failed when the vehicle was destroyed, lighting up the night sky in a brilliant orange blaze. Realizing that the southern end was securely held by the enemy, Frost concentrated his small force on holding the northern approach. They dug in, set up their anti-tank guns, and prepared to wait for the arrival of the main division and the heavy armor of British 30th Corps. They were instructed to hold the bridge for 2 days. They had no idea that they were about to endure one of the most heroic and agonizing sieges in modern military history. By the morning of Monday, September 18th, the reality of the Allied position was becoming terrifyingly clear. At the Arnhem Bridge, John Frost's 500 men were completely isolated. Behind them,
The rest of the British 1st Airborne Division was trapped in a shrinking perimeter around the town of Oosterbeek, fighting for their lives against relentless attacks by SS infantry, tanks, and self-propelled artillery. The radio silence continued. General Urquhart was cut off from his own troops for nearly 36 hours, at one point forced to hide in the attic of a Dutch home, while German soldiers occupied the ground floor. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the south, the ground offensive of Operation Garden was falling disastrously behind schedule. The British 30 Corps, led by the tanks of the Guards Armoured Division, had launched its assault on Sunday afternoon, preceded by a massive artillery barrage and rocket-firing Typhoon fighters. But the single road to Arnhem, dubbed Hell's Highway by the American paratroopers, proved to be an operational nightmare. The road was raised above the surrounding marshlands, leaving the leading tanks completely exposed to German anti-tank crews hidden in the tree lines. Whenever the lead tank was knocked out, the entire column of hundreds of vehicles was brought to a dead stop until the burning wreckage could be bulldozed off the narrow road. German counterattack struck the highway repeatedly, slicing through the thin line of communication, blowing up supply trucks, and forcing Allied armor to stop and clear the flanks before moving forward.
The timetable was slipping away, minute by precious minute.
At the Arnhem Bridge, the German military realized that Frost's small force at the northern ramp was blocking the main supply route between Arnhem and Nijmegen. On the morning of September 18th, the commander of the 9th SS Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion, Hauptsturmführer Victor Grebner, decided to smash through Frost's defences with raw power. Grebner, decorated with the Knight's Cross for bravery just the day before, led a column of 22 armoured cars and half-tracks across the bridge from the south at high speed, their machine guns spitting fire. Frost's paratroopers waited in total silence until the lead German vehicles reached the centre of the bridge. Then, at Frost's command, the northern ramp erupted into a terrifying roar of violence. Anti-tank guns, PIAT anti-tank launchers, mortar rounds and sniper fire poured into the German column. Vehicles exploded in flames, trapping those behind them. German half-tracks swerved off the roadway, crashing into the steel girders of the bridge. The battle raged for 2 hours in blinding smoke and scorching heat. When the firing finally ceased, 12 German armoured vehicles lay destroyed or burning on the bridge, and Hauptsturmführer Grebner was dead. The British held the northern ramp, but their victory came at a heavy cost in ammunition, medical supplies, and human lives. By the third day, September 19th, the weather over Western Europe began to deteriorate rapidly. Thick fog and heavy rain blankets rolled over the English Channel and the drop zones in Holland, grounding Allied transport aircraft and bombers. Reinforcements and supply drops could not take off from airfields in Britain. The small amount of resupply aircraft that did manage to brave the weather arrived over Arnhem without knowing that the Allied drop zones had been captured by the Germans. In a heartbreaking display of tragic courage, Royal Air Force pilots flew low through intense anti-aircraft fire to drop crates of food, water and ammunition directly into the hands of the waiting SS troops, while the starving, low on ammo British paratroopers watched helplessly from their foxholes just a few hundred yards away. In Nijmegen, the operation hit another agonizing wall. The American 82nd Airborne and the advancing tanks of 30 Corps had reached the city, but the massive steel road bridge over the Waal River was heavily fortified by the 10th SS Panzer Division. German troops had dug in on the northern bank, armed with heavy artillery, machine guns, and anti-tank cannons. Every attempt to rush the bridge from the south was repulsed with heavy losses. The bridge had to be captured immediately if 30 Corps was to have any hope of reaching John Frost's men at Arnhem before they were completely wiped out. It was here, on the afternoon of September 20th, that one of the most astonishing feats of bravery of World War II took place. Brigadier General James Gavin ordered a daring amphibious assault across the Waal River to capture the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge. Major Julian Cook of the 82nd Airborne's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment led his men to the riverbank. They were provided with 26 flimsy, collapsible canvas assault boats, boats that many of the men had never seen or operated before. Under cover of a light smoke screen and supported by British tank fire, Major Cook and his paratroopers pushed the canvas boats into the swift, broad current of the Waal River. The moment they entered open water, the German guns on the far bank opened fire. The river exploded in pillars of water, shrapnel, and machine gun bullets. The flimsy canvas was shredded, boats were flipped over or blown to pieces, and paratroopers were weighed down by their heavy equipment and drowned in the freezing water. Using their rifle butts as oars, the survivors paddled furiously across the quarter-mile stretch of open river, shouting prayers and encouraging one another. Against all odds, the surviving paratroopers reached the northern shore, scrambled up the slippery mud embankment under direct fire, and launched a ferocious bayonet charge against the German bunkers. Simultaneously, British tanks of the Grenadier Guards surged across the Nijmegen road bridge from the south, smashing through German blockades just as the charges set to blow the bridge were disconnected by brave Dutch resistance fighters and American paratroopers. By nightfall on September 20th, the Great Bridge at Nijmegen was finally in Allied hands. The road to Arnhem was open. But for the defenders of Arnhem Bridge, the victory at Nijmegen came too late. For 4 days and 4 nights, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 500 men had held the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge against an entire SS Panzer division. They had fought without sleep, without water, and with virtually no medical supplies. The brick houses they occupied had been systematically reduced to piles of rubble by German heavy artillery and tanks firing at point-blank range. Phosphorus shells had set the buildings ablaze, roasting the defenders inside and forcing them to drag their wounded into stifling basements. The air was filled with the blinding dust of shattered brick, the stench of high explosives, and the agonizing screams of injured men. By the evening of September 20th, Frost himself had been severely wounded by shrapnel in both legs. Ammunition was down to its final rounds. Men were fighting off German infantry with knives, rifle butts, and bare hands. The underground cellars were filled with hundreds of wounded Allied soldiers and German prisoners. Realizing that further resistance in the burning ruins was impossible, and with no ammunition left to stop enemy armor, the surviving British paratroopers agreed to a brief ceasefire to allow the wounded to be evacuated into German captivity. Small groups of uninjured men tried to slip away into the dark streets to rejoin the main division at Oosterbeek, but most were hunted down and captured. On the morning of Thursday, September 21st, German tanks rolled unopposed across the Arnhem road bridge, driving south toward Nijmegen. John Frost's men had been ordered to hold the bridge for 48 hours. They had held it for nearly 90 hours against overwhelming armored odds. Their magnificent defense had bought precious time, but the bridge was now lost. With the fall of the Arnhem Bridge, the remaining forces of the British 1st Airborne Division were completely surrounded in a tiny, horseshoe-shaped perimeter in the woods and suburban streets of Oosterbeek, anchored against the northern bank of the lower Rhine. Commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart, roughly 3,000 surviving British paratroopers, glidermen and Polish paratroopers, who had dropped into a death trap at Driel under heavy fire, were trapped in what became known as the Cauldron. For 5 brutal days, the Cauldron was subjected to an unrelenting, merciless bombardment. German artillery, mortars, and sniper fire rained down upon the perimeter from 3 sides. Heavy Panther and Tiger tanks crawled down the tree-lined streets of Oosterbeek, blasting individual houses to dust. British soldiers dug narrow foxholes in the soft soil of private gardens, crouching beneath the roots of pine trees while artillery shells exploded in the canopy above, raining lethal wooden splinters down upon them. Food was non-existent. Men chewed on raw vegetables dug up from Dutch gardens or drank dirty water from radiator pipes and muddy puddles. Down in Nijmegen,
Lieutenant General Frederick Browning watched in helpless frustration as the operation he had helped craft collapsed into disaster. The ground column of 1010 Corps made a frantic attempt to break through the final 10 miles of flooded polderland between Nijmegen and Arnhem, but the narrow road was easily defended by German anti-tank teams. The heavy British tanks slipped off the mud embankments and sank into the soft soil, becoming sitting targets for German 88mm guns. Every effort to reach the trapped paratroopers at Oosterbeek failed. On the night of September 21st, Major General Stanislav Sosabowski's Polish brigade attempted to cross the lower Rhine in small rubber boats to reinforce the Oosterbeek perimeter, but German searchlights illuminated the river, and heavy machine gun fire wiped out boat after boat. Only a handful of Polish soldiers reached the northern bank. The trap was sprung shut, and the teeth of the German armour were grinding the British 1st Airborne Division into dust. By September 25th, 8 days after the initial landings, the situation at Oosterbeek was beyond desperate. Major General Urquhart's division had reached the absolute limit of human endurance. Over a third of his men were wounded or dead. Medical posts set up in local hotels were overflowing, with blood soaking through the floorboards into the cellars below. Ammo was virtually exhausted, and the perimeter was collapsing house by house. Recognizing that the British 1st Airborne Division faced total annihilation, Field Marshal Montgomery and General Browning finally issued the order that marked the ultimate admission of failure: Operation Berlin. The remaining Allied troops at Oosterbeek were to evacuate the northern bank of the lower Rhine under cover of darkness, and retreat to safety across the river to Allied-held territory in the south. On the night of September 25th, under a heavy torrential rainstorm, one of the most tragic and heart-wrenching evacuations of the war began. British and Polish soldiers wrapped their boots in strips of blankets and old rags to muffle their footsteps in the mud. Leaving their heavy equipment behind and leaving their brave medical staff with the non-transportable wounded in the basements, the men formed long, silent human chains in the pitch-black woods, holding onto the belt of the man in front of them so as not to get lost in the dark. They moved quietly toward the riverbank, where Canadian and British engineers operated small assault boats, paddling back and forth across the rushing black waters of the Rhine under intense German artillery and machine gun fire. Searchlights swept the river, periodically catching small boats in their white beams before artillery shells exploded nearby, flipping the craft and throwing exhausted soldiers into the icy current. All night long, through the cold rain and mortar fire, the evacuation continued. When dawn broke on the morning of September 26th, the grey light revealed a scene of utter devastation. The evacuation was halted, leaving behind hundreds of men who could not reach the boats in time. They were gathered up as prisoners by advancing German troops, who marveled at the hollowed-out, exhausted faces of the men who had fought them so fiercely for 9 days. Of the nearly 10,000 brave men of the British 1st Airborne Division and Polish Brigade who had dropped into Arnhem on September 17th, only 2,187 managed to escape across the Rhine. Over 1,400 had been killed, and more than 6,000 were taken prisoner, many of them severely wounded. The British 1st Airborne Division was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, and would never see combat again in the war. When the dust settled over the flooded polders and shattered towns of Holland, the full scale of the catastrophe of Operation Market Garden became undeniable. The Allies had succeeded in carving a narrow, 60-mile salient into German-occupied Holland, liberating cities like Eindhoven and Nijmegen. But the main strategic objective, the vital bridge over the lower Rhine at Arnhem, the gateway to Germany, remained firmly in German hands. The operation had failed. In the aftermath of the disaster, a bitter fight for historical reputation and institutional survival broke out among the Allied High Command. Field Marshal Montgomery, unwilling to publicly admit that his grand operational concept was flawed, issued an astonishing statement to the press,
claiming that Operation Market Garden was 90% successful. But to the soldiers who had survived the inferno of Arnhem and Oosterbeek, and to the families of the thousands who had died, Montgomery's words rang out as a hollow, insulting absurdity.
Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, acutely aware that his dismissal of intelligence and his strategic overconfidence were central to the disaster, sought a scapegoat to deflect criticism from himself and British High Command. He turned his sights on Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, the commander of the Polish Parachute Brigade. Sosabowski had been the one officer who had explicitly warned Browning before the operation that the plan was deeply flawed and that German strength was being dangerously underestimated. Browning wrote a blistering, unjust official report to the British War Office, accusing Sosabowski of being uncooperative, argumentative, and unfit for high command, effectively blaming the Polish commander for the tactical failures south of the Rhine. As a result of Browning's political maneuvering, Sosabowski was stripped of his command by the Polish government in exile under heavy British pressure. Sosabowski spent the remainder of his life in quiet dignity, working as a factory labourer in post-war London, his visionary military warnings ignored, and his career unfairly tarnished by the very men whose arrogance had caused the tragedy. Decades later, history would fully vindicate Sosabowski, with the Dutch government posthumously awarding him the highest military honours for his extraordinary bravery and tactical foresight at Arnhem. Major Brian Urquhart, the young intelligence officer who had presented the photographic evidence of the SS Panzer divisions only to be declared mentally exhausted and sent on medical leave, returned to active duty after the operation's collapse. His warnings had been tragically validated in the blood of thousands of his comrades. Urquhart went on to have a distinguished career as a foundational leader of the United Nations, helping to pioneer international peacekeeping operations. Throughout his life, Urquhart spoke candidly about the dangerous military hubris that had infected Allied headquarters in September 1944. A hubris that prioritized wishful thinking over hard, cold intelligence on the ground. Yet it was a single phrase uttered by General Browning himself that would forever capture the essence of the disaster. In the tense days before the operation launched, when Montgomery was explaining the rapid timetable of 1010 Corps rushing down the narrow road to secure successive bridges, Browning had looked closely at the map, reflecting on the vast distance to the final river crossing. He turned to Montgomery and voiced a quiet, haunting doubt that he would later try to forget. "I think we may be going a bridge too far." Those 6 words, "a bridge too far," became the immortal epitaph of Operation Market Garden. They summarized the fatal flaw of an operation born of supreme arrogance and blind optimism. It was an operation that ignored clear, indisputable intelligence, underestimated a resilient and veteran enemy, and placed thousands of elite soldiers in an impossible situation where courage alone could not overcome the terrible reality of heavy armor and logistical failure. The failure at Arnhem had profound, catastrophic consequences for the broader war in Europe. The hope of ending the conflict by Christmas 1944 was shattered. Instead of collapsing, Nazi Germany used the defensive victory at Market Garden to stabilize its Western Front, regroup its battered armies, and prolong the war by 8 long, agonizing months. This delay allowed the German military to mount its last desperate, bloody offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, 2 months later. For the civilian population of the Netherlands, the failure of Market Garden brought an unimaginable tragedy. In retaliation for a nationwide railway strike organized by the Dutch underground to support the Allied invasion, the German occupying forces cut off all food and fuel shipments to the western provinces of Holland. The winter of 1944 to 1945 became known in Dutch history as the Hongerwinter, the Hunger Winter. Over 20,000 Dutch civilians starved to death in frozen cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague,
while hundreds of thousands were forced to eat tulip bulbs and sugar beets to survive until final liberation in May 1945. Today, the quiet streets of Arnhem and Oosterbeek bear few visible scars of the violent inferno that consumed them in September 1944. The road bridge over the lower Rhine, rebuilt after the war, now officially bears the name of the brave British commander who held its northern ramp against impossible odds, the John Frost Bridge. Nearby, in the pristine, quiet grounds of the Arnhem-Oosterbeek War Cemetery, over 1,700 white headstones stand in immaculate, parallel rows beneath the shade of towering trees. They mark the final resting places of British, American, Polish, and Canadian soldiers who jumped into the blue Dutch sky with hopes of ending a terrible war, only to fall victim to the hubris of command and the tragic rejection of truth. The story of Operation Market Garden remains a timeless, sobering lesson in the history of human conflict. It serves as a reminder that victory is never guaranteed by grand visions or supreme confidence alone, and that when military commanders choose to ignore uncomfortable intelligence in favor of comforting illusions, it is always the brave, ordinary soldiers on the front line who pay the ultimate, terrible price.